We're heading back in time to the gritty, electric, and, let's be honest, often dangerous streets of New York City in the early 1980s. And at the heart of our story is a really tragic mystery. You've got a young, promising artist who has an encounter with the police and ends up in a coma. The official story? They said he went berserk. But what eyewitnesses and the medical evidence tell us, well, that's a very different and much more disturbing story. So let's start with the sounds. Imagine being woken up by this. That's a quote from a student, a freshman, who heard something that night that would stick with her forever. I mean, that cuts right to the bone, doesn't it? And it immediately makes you ask, what in the world was happening on that street? Okay, so let's set the scene. The date is September 15th, 1983. It's late, around 3 in the morning. We're in Union Square, Manhattan. And for the new students at the Parsons School of Design dorm right there, this was their welcome to the city. A sound so terrifying it pulled them right out of their beds and over to their windows. And what they saw? Well, the details are just chillingly specific. Students like Chris Seister had this bird's eye view, and they described seeing a black man on the ground surrounded by police. Get this. His testimony describes an officer using a nightstick not to hit the man, but as a lever, pulling it up against his neck. From another window, another student, John Gunderson, heard the man pleading, and he saw something absolutely crucial. The man's arms were already tied up behind his back. But even so, he was surrounded by at least 3 or 4 officers, with more just standing by as he's crying out for help. And then, this is the final thing the student saw. After the screaming stopped, after the man was totally motionless, he was carried over to a police van. The witness, Candace Baker, said she'd never forget how casual it was. She said it was like they were throwing a bag of mulch onto a truck. Which, brings us to the biggest questions in this whole story. The amount of force here just seems completely off the charts. What could have possibly led to this? And just as important, who was this man at the center of all this violence? To really get what happened, you have to understand the man himself. This wasn't just some random person on the street. No, he was part of this incredibly vibrant, creative world that was basically defining New York City in the 80s. And that world, it would be the one to rise up and demand answers for him. This was Michael Stewart. He was 25, an artist. And people who knew him said he had this quiet, thoughtful presence, which is such a huge contrast to the loud, chaotic energy of the city around him. After hearing about the violence, seeing his face, it just makes it all so much more personal. Michael was living what the source material calls a cobbled-together life, which was super common for artists downtown back then. He was doing it all. He was an artist, a DJ, a model. He was a regular at the famous Pyramid Club, and he ran in the same circles as guys who were about to become superstars, like Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat. He was right there, in the middle of the scene. And he wasn't just messing around, He had huge ambitions. His friend Chino Ludwig said Michael dreamed of being worldwide. He wanted his own solo show, the kind of thing that was launching his peers into the stratosphere. He had a future, one he was working hard to build, and it was about to be completely erased. So from the dark street, the story shifts to the bright, sterile, and chaotic rooms of Bellevue Hospital. This is where Michael's life was now hanging by a thread. The scene at the emergency room was just a total mess. Michael gets there, he's in a coma, he isn't breathing, he's still in handcuffs. And in fact, they couldn't even start treating him right away because the cops couldn't find the key. And then, to top it all off, this young black man from Brooklyn was somehow logged into the hospital's records as an unknown white male. The doctors, they needed to figure out how bad his condition was. So they used a standard medical scale to assess him. And the score they gave him was this: 3. So what does a 3 even mean? Well, on the Glasgow Coma Scale, a score of 15 is a totally normal, conscious person. A 3 is the lowest possible score you can get. It means a complete lack of brain function. It is as bad as it gets. So a neurosurgery resident, Dr. Duncan McBride, he examines Michael. He's not seeing a skull fracture, but he is seeing bruises on his neck and all the signs of an anoxic brain injury, which is damage from a total lack of oxygen. His professional medical opinion: Michael's condition could be explained by pressure on his neck. He thought his patient had been strangled. And right here, This is where the whole case just splits into two completely different realities. You have what the police said happened, and then you have what the eyewitnesses and the doctors saw. And these two stories, they could not be more different. All right, let's just break it down. The official story that started coming out in the news was that Michael was arrested for graffiti, he went berserk, tried to run, and fell down. Okay, but the evidence? Witnesses saw a man whose hands were already tied being beaten by multiple officers. Doctors found bruises on his neck, his wrists, and his ankles, and they diagnosed an injury that looks a lot like strangulation. These two versions of reality, they just don't fit together at all. And in those first critical hours, the system seemed to, well, either completely fall apart or work exactly the way it was supposed to. At 2:57 a.m., the first call for backup goes out. By about 3:15, Michael is at the hospital, in a coma. But then, the delays start. By 7:25 a.m., the Transit Police's own Internal Affairs Division actually refuses to investigate because they said no civilian had filed the complaint. By the time prosecutors finally show up, almost 8.5 hours later, all 11 officers had been left alone together, with plenty of time to get their stories straight. But here's the thing. This wasn't just happening in a vacuum. News about what happened to Michael Stewart just ripped through the East Village art scene. And for them, this wasn't some abstract story. It was deeply, deeply personal. And it sparked this immediate, powerful response that shows you how art can become a really potent form of protest. This quote from Jean-Michel Basquiat, man, it just says everything. Basquiat and Stewart were both young Black artists. They had similar hairstyles, they moved through the same neighborhoods, and were often hassled for how they looked. For Basquiat and for a lot of other people, what happened to Michael wasn't some random tragedy. It felt like a direct threat, a chilling reminder of just how vulnerable they were. So what does a community of artists do? They fight back with what they know best, art. The artist David Wojnarowicz created this really powerful flyer, showing these skeleton cops beating a handcuffed man, and they were plastered all over the neighborhood. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was an act of defiance, using art to challenge the official story and scream for accountability. And it wasn't a small thing either. On September 26, just 11 days after the incident, hundreds of people gathered for a protest right back where it all started, in Union Square. It was put together by a legendary club doorman, Howie Montag, and the crowd was basically a who's who of the downtown scene. Keith Haring, Kenny Scharf, even a young Madonna was there. They stood in front of this huge banner that just read, "Why Murdered?" and demanded justice, turning a creative scene into a powerful political force. After 13 days in a coma, Michael Stewart died. 6 of the 11 officers there that night were indicted by a grand jury. But after a long trial, every single one of them was acquitted of all charges. The justice system looked at this case, at all the evidence, and officially found that no crime was committed. Which leaves us with the same haunting question that gives the book its title. If the system found no one was responsible, then who killed Michael Stewart?